Well, welcome to the monthly meeting. And for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Danielle. I'm one of the chairs of the Policy and Advocacy subcommittee. And I'm excited to talk to you about all the things that we've been doing this year and we've been working on. If you have any questions, we'll try to leave some time at the end, just put them in the chat box. So let's get started. We wanted to start with our mission statement and just really to explain from a high level that we advocate for policy and legislation and that advances the role of architects in addressing climate change. We promote legislation that encourages high performance, low carbon impact buildings, environmental justice, with groups that share similar goals and want to advance similar policy. A good example of that is AIA Resolution 2019. There was just an overwhelming vote of confidence for urgent and sustained action. And in 2019, that's when the AIA adopted the COTE Top 10 measures as a framework for design excellence. And so this set the stage for the AIA to reframe the way that design awards are evaluated. And this is also just an excerpt from the most recent AIA Climate Action Plan, which we refer to this a lot because it's very simplistic in its description, but it doesn't leave any gray area for what we need to do, which is take action. And so at the beginning of this year, Policy and Advocacy outlined, like the other subcommittees, primary initiatives for that we wanted to tackle in 2021. And there were several diverse topics that loosely related to each other, but we wanted to hold the appropriate parties responsible for their actions, whether it is climate action plan initiatives or plastic producer responsibility. We've spent a lot of time debating and investigating how best to use our connections and to support our common goals. And we planned this Spring into Action event. Preparing for this event really helped us develop the framework for this multifaceted approach to policy research, but also policy research related to built environment and infrastructure. And basically, to oversimplify our approach, I will outline 4 sections that we're advocating for in various ways, and my teammates will elaborate on them later in the presentation. And so we'll start with electrification, which refers to the process of replacing technologies that use electricity as a source of energy. Obviously, coal, oil, natural gas, and depending on those resources used to generate energy, electrification can potentially reduce the carbon dioxide emissions from the transportation, building, and industrial sectors, which generally account for around 63% of all of the US greenhouse gas emissions. And addressing emissions from these sectors is critical to decarbonizing the economy and ultimately mitigating the impacts of climate change. And then we'll move on to procurement, which is regulations and requirements for the process of purchasing goods and services, especially with respect to high carbon materials used for the majority of construction in a specific city or state. And then we have adaptive reuse, which is the process of repurposing buildings for viable new uses and modern functions other than those originally intended to address present day needs. And reuse is important because it allows for buildings' continued use and helps it to retain a viable community asset. And lastly, but certainly not least, deconstruction is the selective dismantlement of building components, specifically for reuse, repurposing, recycling, and waste management. And deconstruction is a method of harvesting what is commonly considered waste and reclaiming it into useful building material. And so on this slide, so a long list of collaborators that we, very distinguished people that we have met with and tried to enhance our knowledge and expertise and just further our research. Starting with our, Spring into Action that I spoke about earlier, we had Ed Misria and Senator Carolyn Comita, who, as you know, Ed Misria was the founder of Architecture 2030. And then we have Bruce King, a structural engineer who helped write the Marin County Low Carbon Concrete Code. We have a number of collaborators from New York, including engineers from AKF, or Fast and Up, and the Open Air Collaborative, which helped advise us on how Local Law 87 and LECLA, which is the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Acts. And I think I got that right. And basically, I mean, I can go through this whole list of people, but basically we've just been doing this extensive research to really see what's going on around the country that can relate to Philadelphia, that can help us really target our advocacy and really target specific legislation within those 4 topics I spoke about in a way that will advance our efforts, and just really trying to focus on a continued conversation with our Office of Sustainability. We've been speaking with Christine Knapp on potential legislation, and continued conversation with Carbon Leadership Forum and Nick Esposito and all of the other COTE members in Pittsburgh and New York that have just been really instrumental to all of our knowledge and research so far. And so the sort of hidden agenda behind this presentation is that we are trying to encourage all of you all to join us on Advocacy Day, which will be Friday, November 19th. And hopefully after this presentation, you all feel confident, which you should. As architects, we're much more comfortable with these topics than legislators are. And so it's the more people we have encouraging all of these really important, critical topics, the better. So with that, I will hand it off to Brian, who will talk to you about the first topic.
Thanks, Danielle. So I'm going to talk about electrification, and I'm going to talk a little bit longer maybe than the other topics, but that doesn't mean the other topics aren't as equally important. It's just we have a conversation with Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson on Tuesday, and our head has been in electrification as we're trying to get ready for that conversation, just to really understand a little bit better about what the resolution that she's proposed with Councilman Heenan to basically bring a a decarbonization, they're calling it, but we call it electrification type of resolution and legislation to Philadelphia. So let's get into it. Next, let's go to the first slide. So why electrification? So pollution affects all of us, but we know that pollution affects certain groups a little bit more, and this is DEP's environmental justice viewer, still a site and tool that's in progress, but it basically maps, you can see the pop-up there in pink and in purple, communities that are have more than 20% of their population in poverty, or 30% that are minority groups, and the tabs at the upper left really are able you to toggle on certain things like where are industrial waste locations, air emission plants, electric generation plants, municipal waste stations, commercial hazardous waste. And now we know, advanced recycling passed, sort of under the radar, but that's a dirty word for burning plastics and recyclables. So those plants we know happen closer to some of these populations, and that just shouldn't happen. So next slide. Talking a little bit more about why we electrify. I mean, Pennsylvania is a big player in the carbon dioxide emissions market for the states. So we're number 4. Woohoo! But we'd like to be lower on that list. So next slide. We're also number 2 when it comes to natural gas production behind Texas. So there's reasons why Pennsylvania has been slow to get on board with RGGI and other carbon emission types of regulations, because we have a large fossil fuel industry. We export a lot of natural gas to other states, and in the case of liquefied natural gas, to other countries. So next slide. This is a great tool that I invite everybody to investigate, the Yale program on climate change communication. I've been sharing this with a lot of folks recently, and it's been around for a while. It has survey and map tools that are just phenomenal about different survey points for the environment. I've focused particularly on their maps on who supports regulating CO2 as a pollutant. And this particular map shows the national average, among Democrats is 90% and Republicans 64%, and that averages to about 75. So I think 75% of Americans are okay with this. So why don't we have, Waxman-Markey, why didn't that pass in 2008? Why don't we have a national carbon regulation, type of law? Don't know, Next slide. Pennsylvania. So again, these maps, you can hover over each state, see where they are. Pennsylvania pretty much aligns with what's happening nationally, where the Democrats and Republicans, are very similar percentage wise. So next slide. It may seem surprising with results like that, why there was so much opposition to Reggie, but we know because of the fossil fuel interest that that's why the opposition. So Reggie, for those of you not familiar, it's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that was passed by executive order by Governor Wolf. The legislation has fought it tooth and nail. They don't want to be in it. This slide's a little out of date because New Jersey has actually already joined, and Virginia, you put an X through that. It's now Virginia is also in. So there's 11 states and 12 with Pennsylvania joining, and the proceeds from the carbon emitters in Pennsylvania will start to roll in next year. So, and again, for those of you not familiar, it's if you go back slide for a second. Reggie, is essentially putting a fee on carbon. The major electricity producers, the coal and natural gas plants, are going to be the big contributors there. It's not, they're not coming to your house because you have an oil or gas boiler and taxing you. So Pennsylvania, as I had mentioned in the earlier slide, we're a big emitter. So we actually emit more than, at the time this slide was taken, more than all 9 other Reggie states combined. So that it's a little bit of an explanation about why we were reluctant to join. So next slide. One thing I do want to point out too, so in addition to understanding why we do electrification, a little bit about how we electrify too. And we're still defining, how that's going to happen for buildings. But another how that will come up if you go into advocacy meetings with the legislators is about jobs. Jobs are really important to legislators. They're always being asked how to create jobs in their district. And, when we transition to a renewable energy economy, or basically a green economy as we see it, where we're encouraging high efficiency buildings, it's important to recognize that the people with fossil fuel jobs have a viable future. There has to be some form of education and support that goes along with that. This data that's shown here basically illustrates how construction is a very good alternative for those fossil fuel workers that can provide, even for people without college degrees, high, well-paying jobs in the construction market. And they're some among the top jobs that are out there for people without college degrees. So it's a really good opportunity. And I talk to people throughout the state who work in construction. They're looking for good workers to hire. So next slide. So electrification policy, it's happening, across the country. This is just a snapshot of some of the states and cities that have, electrification policies. California, we know that they're a leader in green energy. They just took a huge step, as you saw there. They're making electric heat pumps the baseline for new homes and buildings. So that's just phenomenal. They're leading the charge there. New York, as Danielle mentioned, we spoke to Charlie Marino at AKF, who was on the Mayor's Council for advancing Local Law 97. Local Law 97, again, existing buildings, any and new construction, any emitters, you basically have to pay a fee. So if you want to avoid that fee, you have to renovate your building and electrify it. Make it more energy efficient, so that there's obviously a construction possibility, and what the graph you can't really see there, but they're projecting over the next 10 years or so that there'll be a $20 billion investment in New York for that, and the intent is to be carbon free by 2040 and have a complete net zero carbon economy by 2050. Boston recently passed their BERDO 2.0. So BERDO stands for Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. That may sound familiar because we actually have a disclosure ordinance in Philadelphia too. So a disclosure benchmarking ordinance, as it was called here, since 2012, I believe, has required all major commercial building owners to report their energy use. And now we have the building performance, so we have a tune-up law. They've taken it even farther and said that basically any building over 20,000 square feet has to achieve zero carbon emissions by 2050. So just great momentum here. And Chicago, as you can see at last slide on the right there, they have a decarbonization working group that they're looking really heavily into equity too, and how they do that in the city. So they have a group that has formed in their city. They have partnerships with NRDC and a couple other organizations that are looking at this. And of course, as we're reading about this, I see that they're researching 12 other North American cities with decarbonization. So we're like, well, this is just a snapshot of like 3. So we got a lot more homework to do. Every time we turn around, there's more cities that pop up that are working on this. So Philadelphia has got to get into that too. And that's why we're talking to Councilwoman Gilmore Richardson on Tuesday to find out where her head is and how we can be of support. Next slide. All right. So Steve, I don't know if you want to talk to this one just real quickly.
Very happy to. The Pennsylvania Climate Action Plan is
I'll just ask one quick question. Sorry, Steve. Brian, when is that meeting with Richardson? Is it going to be during your normal?
Yeah,
4 o'clock?
Tuesday,
Okay.
Tuesday, 4:30.
All right. Sorry, Steve. Go ahead.
No worries. So the Pennsylvania Climate Action Plan is part of legislation that was passed in 2008, Act 70 of Pennsylvania. We have to produce the Climate Action Plan every 3 years. This is the 5th edition. I've been involved in 4. For instance, we have members of the Climate Change Advisory Committee, myself as chairman, and then Mark Mondor is vice chair. The 2 of us have been on the board for a long time, and I have just appointed Brian Smiley as my delegate. So we're continue to try and be an active part of the Climate Action Advisory Committee. And the big thing here is that we make recommendations to the legislature and the governor for policy change. And they have responded. The governor has had a number of executive orders. We have had some legislation passed. And one of those executive orders, which we had recommended, was RGGI, for instance, is RGGI. So the work that we've been doing has resulted in action, and we're very excited about that. Some of the examples of things that have been done and funding that is available to help do these things. We're pushing a lot of the electric vehicle. Transportation is a huge part of what we're doing. Certainly, there's wind farms across central Pennsylvania and up on Lake Erie. And again, just about electrification in the urban environment. We're trying to remove fossil fuel use at the buildings we design. So that's the goal, is that we can use a green electric grid to provide the energy that our buildings use. So when you're designing, just keep in mind that we're looking for heat pumps, VFR systems, things along those nature, obviously LED lighting, And there is funding for all of that. Is that on another slide? There's multiple sources
yeah.
of funding.
I don't know if I have funding. I basically go to the next slide, Danielle. This just real quick just talks about the emissions pie, you know, what we want to focus on. So on the left there is the national percentage of 13 for commercial and residential buildings. It's more than 13, as we know, because when you look at on the right, that's just Pennsylvania. Residential and commercial is 11%, so pretty close in Pennsylvania as opposed to nationally. But we know that buildings do more because right below that in orange, you have electricity generation, and across the pie on the left where you have the 8% fugitive emissions from energy production. So that is all going to buildings as well. And the other thing of note here too is that industrial emissions, we know from fabrication, which when we talk about procurement a little bit, you know, that's 22% nationally and it's 23% for industrial emissions in Pennsylvania. So go to the next slide real quick. This talks more about implementation, all the strategies that Steve was starting to talk about. This is in the climate action plan just for buildings, but the climate action plan also addresses all those other emission sources. So you see on the left, generation, agriculture, transportation, and industry. So I don't know, Steve, if you want to talk about any of these others real quickly, but this is all.
What we try and do are make incentives to, as part of the climate action plan, we have actionable items that are implementable. That's our focus on developing those on a regular basis. And they change over time as new technologies and new trends become available. Electrification is a big one. And incentivizing that, as I mentioned, there is funding available for builders, owners, and developers to make use of for high performance building funding. There's CPACE funding. There's Act 129 funding. There's a lot of sources to help people make the change and work towards electrification.
Right. Yeah. And actually I do have a slide later so we can gloss over. So the next slide, this I just wanted to quickly, you know, if you're in a meeting with a legislator, you may hear the term scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Just to give you a brief education on this, scope 1 is essentially what you're burning on your site, you know, or if you're driving a vehicle, you know, in your city limits or, you know, there's different, emission assessments too. You have cities that do it, but also companies that do it. So scope 1, think, you know, this is what you're burning right on your site. Scope 2 is when you purchase electricity and that those emissions might be happening outside of your borders or more remote from you. And scope 3, which is the hardest, that's the one that tends to be quantified the least because it's so, I don't want to say confusing, it's hard to quantify. There's more variables. So, and you can see on the right there, you know, purchase good or business travel stuff that it's just really hard to estimate. So next slide. So what Steve was talking about, CPACE, commercial property assessed clean energy, that's basically an assessment that gets put onto your property, but allows you to make these investments, long-term investments in energy efficiency or renewable energy. I'm not going to go through this in more detail. I would encourage you to Google business development through CPACE as a presentation I gave with the Philadelphia Energy Authority. A lot of us heard a little bit of that. SEF.
Also mention that the RGGI funds will be used for this electrification as well. So any energy efficiency, any energy changing, change of use for energy, we will have money available, $200 to $300 million a year, $1 billion over a certain period of time to help people make the switch over.
Yeah, and some of those other programs that Steve mentioned are there on the right. And then housing too, something we're just starting to get our heads around, but ECA has some programs there that do some of the job training that I was mentioning, but also focus on energy conservation and outreach to neighborhoods. So again, with housing or residential and commercial, it's important to address both existing and new construction too. So, getting codes up to date for those new construction buildings is important. So next slide. And just real last here, talking about some state advocacy issues to allow city residents to invest in solar. We really want to get passed in Pennsylvania a community solar bill that makes it happen. You can see here Delaware got it passed, so now that's available to their residents. But we've got to push Pennsylvania forward to get that passed as well. So that's it. Sorry, I went a little long, but on to procurement.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I think the P&A committee could probably talk all day about some of the research, but we'll try and be brief. So procurement really focuses on embodied carbon, and I think preaching to the choir here, but embodied carbon occurs over the entire life cycle of the building, as opposed to operational carbon, which is really during the use stage of the building. And embodied carbon has been under the radar from a policy standpoint, but it's coming into its own because embodied carbon can account for about up to 50% of the total carbon over the lifespan of the building. Next slide. It's also important because of the time value of carbon. Embodied carbon tends to be spent in chunks at discrete points during the life of the building, and the upfront carbon before day one of building occupancy is a significant contributor. So that's, if we're going to meet our climate goals, embodied carbon policy needs to really be part of the equation. And so how is this being proposed? I guess, next slide. With any policy, next slide, you start where the money is. And from a purchasing power standpoint, the government and public projects account for about 32% of total construction in the United States. And you might say, well, 32% is a bit of a minority, but all of the private owners, individually don't have as much collective purchasing power as the government. And so from a policy standpoint, the government is best positioned to implement change that will then ripple through the private sector through these embodied carbon policies. I guess next slide. I'll try to go quickly to leave time for other folks. The policy for embodied carbon is gaining momentum. This is a map from the Carbon Leadership Forum, and the darker yellow slides show states where statewide embodied carbon or buy clean policies are already in place. And the lighter yellow color are states where there's either statewide policies that are currently being proposed, or there's also cities in various states that have, city scale legislation, such as Portland, Oregon, or Hastings on the Hudson in New York. And so, one of our goals of the P&A committee is to try and get Pennsylvania on this map, either through, statewide advocacy or through Philadelphia implementing, embodied carbon legislation locally. Next slide. So how does, buy clean work? Buy clean is, most of the embodied carbon legislation, excuse me, is about procurement. And parts 2, 3, and 4, or steps 2, 3, and 4 are the meat of how these work. And it all starts with data collection. And over the first couple years of implementation of most of these policies, there's a data gathering phase where you're requiring submission of EPDs so that the municipalities can gather data, which will then enable them to set benchmarks. And so step 3 is that once there's enough data to set a benchmark, then that will allow them to require a certain carbon performance to even participate or submit bids on these projects. And over time, as there's additional data gathered, the entity can then lower the bar over time to help increase or improve carbon performance. I guess the other part of these policies is that there has to be incentives. This is one of the big incentives is eligibility to participate in that 32% of government projects, but there's also, in variety of policies, there can be additional incentives for the lowest, carbon concrete value. There can be an added bid incentive, or they can have tax incentives that allow funding of EPDs, or there's a variety of ways, and it varies locally, but the governments can encourage voluntary participation in these programs. And I guess the next slide, you're wondering, what kind of materials are affected by a lot of these policies, and generally structural materials tend to be the heavy hitters from a carbon offender standpoint. So, concrete, steel, and wood tend to be more of a focus, but there's also a variety of architectural materials that are included in some of the policies, particularly some of the, the federal ones. They have aluminum, some of them have glass. And this is not an exhaustive list either, but the lines in green are policies that are active and in place, and some of the ones that are in yellow are still being proposed. But I think the other point to note is that there are cities that are taking individual action, which then can lead towards state action. I guess next slide. In most of the buy clean policies tend to be more of a carrot type approach, but other policies that are out there, which are more of a stick. In California, there's a building code that sets limits on cement content or global warming potential in concrete. And so that's another thing to be aware of. But I think from an advocacy standpoint, the carrot approach is the one that seems to have more widespread momentum. And that's, I think, some of the things we'll be talking about with the councilwoman next week. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin and Helena for adaptive reuse.
Thanks, Denise. So for those of you not familiar with it, next slide, please. For those of you not familiar, adaptive reuse is repurposing an existing building for a new use in order to expand its life cycle, right? And the question really becomes, why do this? Why get into working through existing buildings as opposed to just leveling the site in the beginning? And it starts off with what Denise was initially talking about, which is that sort of high embodied carbon investment. So the existing building has a lot of those high carbon offender materials, right? The superstructure being concrete, steel, or wood, and then some of the exterior materials already being in place. The second piece is efficient construction that becomes a part of it, right? You're able to preserve that superstructure and facade fabric, maybe with some renovations that need to go through, and it'll take you a little bit longer doing the remainder of construction, but by and large, you've saved a lot of time in constructing your envelope. The next piece that often gets overlooked is sort of the neighborhood fabric component of this. Any element of construction, especially in the city of Philadelphia, tends to be something that's very disturbing or changes the look of a neighborhood. And when you have a lot of neighbors seeing buildings in their neighborhood get leveled and rebuilt with these new sort of metal boxes, it tends to leave a bad taste in people's mouths. So by reusing the existing structures, especially ones that have historical importance or maybe define the character of a particular neighborhood, it allows you to garner a little bit more support from the neighbors. And frankly, if we're talking about climate justice, it's something that helps to keep people in their homes and keep them in a familiar area. And then the last piece is the disturbance, right? Any element of construction, if you're doing cranes, deliveries, noise from construction, it's a lot less disturbance if you're reusing the existing building because there are fewer deliveries that are going to happen. There's less crane time. And then also generally you're working within an envelope, so you're going to reduce some of that noise and dust that would otherwise bother the neighbors. Next slide, please. So by reusing the building, you're saving a major portion of construction debris from going into the waste stream, right? This comes from the EPA with a study conducted back in 2018, but 90% of construction waste and debris actually comes from the demolition of buildings, right? This is demolition of buildings and materials. So you're not going to completely reduce this, right? Most likely you're going to have to do some form of gutting on the interior and send some, but by diverting a major portion of that demolition debris, we're helping to bring this number down to something that's a little bit more reasonable. And just to put this into a sense of scale, right? The total volume they're looking at is 600 million tons. 600 million tons, and only 10% of that is related to new construction activities. Next slide, please. So we started this by looking at some other ordinances and what's going on across the US. And there are a couple of policies that we came across, the big one being LA. They actually started this frontier back in 1999 with the goal of revitalizing their downtown. It was a downtown Los Angeles revitalization. We'll talk about that in a minute, but they are revisiting it back in 2020. And the modifications to it are still in the works. They're looking to update it and sort of move it into the next phase. We also came across something in South Carolina called the Abandoned Buildings Revitalization Act, which was passed in 2013. It provides a credit of 25% for renovations and restoring abandoned, unused buildings and putting them back into a useful life on the market, right? So this is not encouraging historic buildings. This is encouraging generic building stock that may otherwise be abandoned and blighting a neighborhood, putting it back into the useful life. There was another one we came across, Yelena was pointing out in Salt Lake City in Utah, they're trying to pass something like this. But by and large, we were surprised at how few policies are out there in regards to adaptive reuse. There are some things that push for historic buildings renovations, but not for generic adaptive reuse standpoint. So the differentiation there is that it's not necessarily buildings that have any type of significance, but it's your just everyday average building as you're going down the street, right? By preserving this building, you're preserving that neighborhood fabric and you're also reducing the overall embodied carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So this is the discussion. We had Karen Leogren come in from LA. She and her team of Givning, an architecture firm out in LA, have been working very much on this change from the adaptive reuse ordinance in LA to the downtown LA community adaptive reuse incentive plan. And they're focusing on the carrot, not so much the stick, right? They're focusing on by helping developers giving them incentives to reuse these existing buildings instead of clearing them out and building taller and bigger. What can they get in return for doing that, right? So if you go to the next slide, please. These are the areas that they're really focusing on, right? It's parking, it's floor area exemptions, it's increased density, which in LA means micro units, right? So not having a minimum size for the amount of units that you can have allows them to build smaller and sort of pack in a higher density in their built environment. That comes with an increased height and new rooftop structures. So they're able to put a new structure, a new story essentially, on top of an existing building if they reuse the building that's already there. And then there's some other pieces like, reduced loading space, not needing amenities, and not counting the basement square footage. Some of that stuff is great for LA because it sounds like they're a little bit more advanced and they've been doing this for 2 decades. But for Philadelphia, we're still on the cusp of this. So in Philadelphia, Yelena and I were talking, we feel like some of the more pertinent items that are relative to this conversation are how do we handle parking incentives, density, so potentially smaller unit sizes. I don't think we're quite at the micro apartment level yet. And as well as increased height and potentially some level of, maybe an additional structure or story that comes with that. So in Philly, we're still forming the opinion of what is and isn't up for discussion in the city, what we think will have some opportunity. Next slide, please. So in Philadelphia, we look at our city and we say, there's so many opportunities to do this here, right? We have a ton of older building stock, especially when you figure some of the older masonry buildings in the city that are just massive potential for being reused. And a couple great examples are the Bach building, J Central up in Kensington, which is one that's going through the Spring Arts District around, between 9th and 13th and Spring Garden, and 2424 Studios up on York Street up in my neighborhood. Excellent examples of buildings that have been reused as opposed to clearing the site and tearing them down. A lot of these do tend to be old masonry buildings. Some of them have some significance within the community, but maybe not enough to be historically designated. So we had a conversation with Carl Dress from the Historic Preservation Commission, and he was talking about the fact that the city has an RFP out for conducting a citywide survey of buildings to determine their historical importance. And we feel like this is a really great opportunity to work with them and find ways that we can be mutually beneficial, right? A building may not have historical significance, but it may be important in the neighborhood, and we can provide incentives for reusing that building rather than clearing it down. And some of the other ones we were looking at are the fact that there's existing tax abatement is in place. It's expiring at the end of 2021 for new construction, but existing renovation projects, it will remain. And then potentially some of the zoning bonuses you can get through the code right now, like the Housing Trust Fund, allow you to add 7 feet in height. So maybe we can use that as a starting point to kind of match that, but other bonuses for something on the adaptive reuse, and then potentially increase lot coverage. So a lot of the existing buildings don't fit into the zoning codes as they were redefined. So they may not have that 20 or 25% open area that's necessary. So perhaps we can, grandfather that in and potentially allow additional coverage to offset sort of the embodied carbon savings that they're doing. And next slide, please. I think that's it. Turn it over to Daphne with deconstruction.
Okay,
Actually,
thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what is deconstruction? Like Danielle mentioned in the beginning, it's the careful dismantlation of building components for reuse. And this is different from demolition, where we're normally just knocking a building down and landfilling the material. So this is kind of overlapping with some of the work that the Zero Waste Committee is doing. And Allison Arlotta came to speak to the Zero Waste group, I believe it was last week. And that presentation's on YouTube, so it's a great source of information if anyone wants to find out more in our short time that we have left. So actually, deconstruction used to be the norm, and Allison Arlotta showed this slide that kind of shows where the facade of this building was dismantled from one structure and then moved and reassembled in a little bit different manner for a new structure. So with more the development of unions and labor issues, those actually the deconstruction became expensive because of the labor, and the material became the kind of cheap part. And we can all agree that that's a good thing, but now we're kind of seeing the opportunity to go back to a method of deconstruction, because that not only saves materials from going to landfills and saves carbon emissions, but it's also going to create jobs through the use of deconstruction. And these are skilled labor jobs that are good and would benefit the community. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the deconstruction is not something that just anyone can do. These are going to be skilled local labor jobs. And it also has a benefit for the community in that when you demolish a building, it causes the release of dust and lead into the air, which has a negative impact on the community. Whereas if you are dismantling a building, then that's going to reduce the environmental impacts to the community, the local community. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Daphne to talk a little bit about the use of salvaged materials.
Thanks, Catherine. And also thank you to our friends for setting up two key points about deconstruction that they may not have been aware of as being so relevant to the deconstruction movement. The first being the urgency of reducing carbon, which there's a strong connection between embodied carbon and materials that are salvaged. The second is the vast volume of waste that is generated through deconstruction and demolition. In Philadelphia, we have 393,328 tons of C&D materials, and all of that is growing with the growing construction. In deconstruction, we have the opportunity to salvage materials at their highest use. This is in contrast to demolition, where the mechanical activity only generates more waste. It's very hard to get the most out of these materials. There is an undeniable connection between embodied carbon and material reuse that we need to understand better and develop metrics for. So what the deconstruction movement is beginning to do is stressing the importance of understanding fundamentally the characteristics of these salvaged materials for their ability to save embodied carbon, sequester carbon, and to conserve virgin resources. Next slide. Please don't be distracted by the modesty of this image, because sometimes deconstruction looks just like this. This house in Portland was covered with a variety of hazardous materials, asbestos-containing materials, lead paint, and even polychlorinated biphenyls. The vast majority of buildings pre-1978 across the US have these kinds of contaminated materials, and deconstruction is an opportunity to carefully dismantle them and to develop a way, an abatement way to remove them so that they do not contaminate the community. Deconstruction is a careful process, which means that you avoid dispersing contaminated particles into the surrounding buildings the way demolition does. I wanted to say that in Portland, again, there are many interesting examples of how at this level, community members were so concerned not only by the amount of demolition that was taking place, but the way it was affecting their environment, that they cleverly combined an initiative where they penalized demolition by passing a lead and asbestos abatement requirement that targeted discharge water coming from structural demolition and made the whole process of demolition much more expensive. So it's a neat way of combining the concerns of the health of the community with the actual deconstruction process. Next slide. This is all about global inspiration on this slide. It comes from the C40 Knowledge Hub, but the truth of the matter is that effective implementation and development of policy in Philadelphia and in any other area must begin by understanding the local market. And the examples in Pittsburgh, in Portland, in Ithaca are very tailored to those communities. One of the things that we can begin to do here in Philadelphia is to establish an advisory council that could bring different stakeholders to try to understand what we think the local barriers are for material reuse. We need to develop a metric for using materials, understanding what they are, but also connect this to metrics with embodied carbon. And this is an emerging area of deconstruction. It is not something that has been hammered out, but it is also an opportunity to converge sort of practical knowledge of materials, theoretical understandings of what works, with technology that is emerging in scanning and evaluating embodied carbon. Thank you. That's it.
So who's going to bring us home? What do we got? I guess we have questions at this point, or I know we ran over, Bunny and David. Do you just want to run over to other committee updates?
Yeah, we've got 9 minutes for all of our committees. So I think we need to jump right in. But that was incredible. It was really great to get to do a deep dive into all of the work that the Policy and Advocacy Subcommittee is up to. And I think there's just been so much research and so much learning and so much action. And it's just really awesome. So let's skip my part. It's there. The dates are there. You can read this. It's available on our Google Drive. Danielle, you want to jump into marketing and outreach?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have too many updates. AIA has been really busy with Design Philly and other events this past month. So a number of our items have been on hold as we try to coordinate with them on the Teams account and the Sprout social network.
And there's been
sign up for a newsletter.
Yeah, there's been a huge sort of behind the scenes workaround where AIA, we don't have access to constant contact anymore. So Samaya and Roshni have been, and Danielle figured out a way that we can still have a newsletter without that program. So if it looks a little funky, that's why it's got passed through a few different email accounts.
You can skip over policy.
Yeah,
we're down to zero waste.
Yeah. Well, people can read the notes, but it's basically we've been bringing in some very interesting speakers that have been sharing their knowledge, and they come from a broad cross-section. We're trying to bring someone from the construction group who might be brave enough to tell us how they're interested in deconstruction, and baby steps. We have this wonderful idea about a design detail competition that was thought of by Lauren Powers, and people are kicking it forward. Jonathan was suggesting that maybe that detail begins with using material waste. So it's evolving, and it's a work in progress, but we're very excited by it. Thank you.
EJ, we have our speakers lined up for the December Philadelphia Forum. We need to get some calls set up with individuals, but our keynote and one of our other speakers, Kofi. Well, I know that Antoine is speaking at the NOMA conference. So he's in Detroit. NOMA's 50th anniversary is in Detroit, so I think this is a big week for them. So it's been a little quiet from him and from Kofi, but I think once we get past this week, we should be able to, get something scheduled with them so we can get their learning objectives written up and get those over to AIA Philly. And then Todd's been doing, a lot of work with ILFI to organize them to come and speak about the JUST label. So there's actually a Philadelphia contingent of ILFI, and looks like Todd's going to be reaching out to have them come in March to our March COTE monthly meeting to speak. And then the big thing for us is we need to work on our sort of strategic planning for the EJ group. We met with the Urban Design Committee last month, and they're going to be collaborating with us on that. So we'll send out a doodle poll to all of the subcommittee leaders so that we can find a time that works for most to talk about what 2022 will bear for our subcommittee. That's it.
Okay. Can I jump in very briefly?
Yep.
design awards, we're waiting to see feedback from the juries for Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and then we'll absorb that and report back to the overall committee. Otherwise, I wanted to say the Design Philly exhibit at the Cherry Street Pier was just awesome, and a lot of sustainable design related products, items, and exhibits on display. So that was a lot of fun. Okay, that's it.
And 2030? I made some updates in the agenda, the notes.
Hey, thanks, Bunny. Is this a different copy? Because I was editing it too earlier this morning.
Yeah, this is the one that's in the meeting. We copied the agenda and then put it into the meeting notes. But I just tried to update some of the dates, make sure that I got them right.
Thanks.
And this one I didn't know.
It's the fourth Thursday of every month. So I guess I'll start from the bottom. We have, Bunny and I have been doing monthly, I guess, office hours, 2 days a month, one evening and one lunchtime. And Bunny's been doing the second Monday and I've been doing the fourth Thursday. It's going okay. I think we need to have a conversation around it because we haven't had anyone join us on any of the meetings yet. So maybe at our next group meeting, we should probably talk about how we might want to make some changes or advertise differently to different audiences. Moving on up to the education sessions, we have a session coming up this November we've partnered with IBIPSA, which stands for the International Building Simulation Performance Association or something like that. It's IBPSA, IBIPSA. International Building Performance Simulation Association. There you go. So we're going to be talking about one of the biggest challenges to creating energy models between architects and engineers, and that is converting a Revit model to an analytical model. And so we have some experts. That IBIPSA has a group that's been working on this, and we're also going to have someone from Ladybug Tools join, since they've been working with NREL to develop new schemas for doing that translation more easily. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session. I hope you guys can join. They're going to share some tips and tricks on how to model in Revit so that you can more easily export an energy model for your engineering consultants. And then in December, we're talking about how to design effective contracts for energy modeling. And we already have 2 architects lined up to join us for that session. We're still waiting on getting an engineering firm to join us. So we're gonna do the architect perspective for contracts, the engineering perspective for contracts. And then KT has this really unique way of working where it's it's like an architect and engineer working together to do the energy modeling perspective. And yeah, so that's going to close out the year and we're getting ready to plan for the next year. And I see we have about a minute left. So I'd love to get any feedback. Actually, that minute's probably for wrap up. So if anyone has any ideas for topics that you want covered, we're thinking about kind of switching it up. So we're not doing a monthly presentation. We actually do a quarterly presentation followed by two workshops on that topic. So it would it would be more one-on-one for 2 months. So like say in January, we present on a topic and then we'd follow up with 2 hands-on kind of like workshops related to that topic in February and March. And then in April, we'd switch to another topic. So if you guys have any big picture topics that you kind of want to dive deeper into, yeah, please, email me, Josh, Bunny, or David, or anyone. Yeah. And that's all for me. And if we have time right now, I'd love to hear it now too. So,
any thoughts?
Oh, sorry. This is directed towards the 2030 group. I've been learning about a Rhino tool that is about circular materials and circular economy. I just saw this on a presentation, and I was wondering if this is something that is part of the work that you are doing. It seems to be some kind of overlay that is being used in energy modeling along with other types of building evaluations related to energy.
Are you talking about the one-click LCA Rhino plugin?
I don't know what it is. It was in a presentation that was called Rhino Circularity.
I haven't heard of it.
I just think it sounds like an interesting opportunity to converge, the circularity of materials, the embodied carbon of materials with so much of the studies that are being done for energy and carbon reduction. Oh yeah,
and the landscape of those tools right now, Daphne, is vast. And I think you're hitting on something that there is definitely a potential quarter that we spend on embodied carbon and sort of evaluating those tools and letting people sort of get in there and work with them during the workshops. I think this is just one of the many, and those in our session in August, where we had Stephanie Carlisle from CLF and a few others speak about embodied carbon. I think we started to hear about the whole landscape of these tools, but haven't been able to have an opportunity to really do a deep dive. I think that coupled with those materials you sent from the work that Boston's done really give us a great set of resources to help people locally address embodied carbon in their projects. It's really about how do you do it in a project? How do you make these things real? And I think that's the mission of 2030 Working Group over the coming year.
Can't wait to see it.
Awesome.
Are there any questions for policy and advocacy before we hop off the line? Well, thank you all so much for putting that together. It was really, really wonderful to have time to get to hear about all of the work that you're doing. It's incredible and it's so needed. And I hope the presentation takes on a life of its own. And we're looking forward to figuring out how we can be involved in Advocacy Day in November.
Great. Excellent. Thanks.
Good to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.